G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. Today on the channel I will be discussing everything we've learned from preseason testing in Bahrain and what that means for our F1 fantasy teams ahead of the first deadline in Australia. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not done so already. So we'll jump straight into the testing headlines for each of the 10 teams in Formula One, what that means for our F1 fantasy teams and key considerations for some of the drivers and constructors on my radar over the next couple of weeks. So starting with McLaren, I was quite impressed with them across the board. The verdict throughout the paddock online was that they are the team to beat. They're setting the benchmark for all of the other teams on the grid and are continuing that momentum on the back of a Constructors' Championship in 2024. So, the simulations across the board for the Papaya were pretty encouraging, all things considered. I think the biggest difference between them and the field was their long run pace. I've got a chart up from F1 telemetry data. I'm stealing this that Rain used in his video recently because I thought it showed a really impressive picture of the gulf between Lando Norris and two of the other front running teams. For the most part, he looked a second to a second and a half ahead of Charles Leclerc and Andrea Kimi Antonelli in terms of average lap pace in the long run capacity. So I think, again, McLaren have got that whole package, single lap to full race distance, bedded in. I don't think there's really much in the way of other top teams that are going to stack up quite to them. So quite encouraged by the signs from what we're seeing. Even the single lap paces, although Piastri was a little way down the order and Lando a little further up the order on day 2. It was quite the opposite conversation on day 3. And I think, again, as with every team, take some of the times you see with a grain of salt because preseason testing only shows us so much because of different fuel loads, different packages, etc. on the car. So I think all in all, McLaren look like the team to beat heading into Australia, and I'm pretty confident they'll certainly be on the radar, both drivers and the constructor, for many F1 fantasy managers ahead of the deadline. For Ferrari, really impressed again, another team that just kind of went in, got the business done and got out. They were consistently around some of the top times each of the days, and I'll again lean on some of the charts I just had up. Day 2 in particular, a sign, I think, of what to expect from Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Being in the top 5 in each of the different sectors, I think bodes well for them. Both typically, at least in Charles' case, a very good qualifier. And I'd say the only reason they were running so far down the order behind even the likes of Esteban Ocon, Yuki Tsunoda, etc., was probably just because of the packages or fuel loads, again, that they had on the car. So something to think about, but I think Ferrari, again, a team that's just very tactical and efficient with how they did their testing and run program throughout the 3 days. Red Bull's one that for me was surprised they had only 304 laps across 3 days, 100 laps a day. Not really that encouraging, but they do run a tight ship. We know that a driver like Max Verstappen is going to keep them in the fight every single race week. But I do think as a fantasy asset to own, Max, I see in almost every situation coming in above 25 million in the A tier. I just worry, given that Lando Norris and even maybe Oscar Piastri, the Ferrari duo too, are we seeing better options elsewhere in terms of value and what you can do with maybe that spare money for other parts of your team? But I guess we won't really know that until the game goes live next week. Liam Lawson, just not really a known commodity. Again, probably a driver that will be comfortably in the B tier, but we'll have to wait and see from free practice in Australia and over the next few races whether or not he's a truly viable fantasy asset to own. Mercedes, much like Liam Lawson, I think going to be firmly rooted in the B tier. Toto Wolff did express that he was a bit concerned that Mercedes in particular operated in that window last year of cooler climates, and their best results in Spa, in Las Vegas, in Canada, all much cooler than some of the other circuits that other teams had more success at. So I think, if it's a similar theme this time around, I worry that a driver like George Russell could be viable, but maybe not quite up to the standard that an Oscar Piastri or the Ferrari guys will have. I think it's a wait and see, but the constructor, should it be again in the B tier, may well become an option for the first race of the season. On the contrary to the top 4 teams that we've talked about that I think had various different highlights throughout the 3 days in Bahrain, Aston Martin didn't really have anything to show for it. The second least amount of laps, a pretty disrupted 3 days, running towards the bottom pretty much the whole time. They had 88 laps only on day 1, and Lance Stroll was sick on the last day of testing. It just doesn't feel like a team, like an asset at all that I'm that confident in investing in for the first race of the season. If we go to day 3 specifically, again, take what you see with a grain of salt, but there's nothing really to suggest to me that Aston Martin have a package that's competitive from the outset. And all I need to do is look at the simulation pace provided by Lawrence Barretto, that sure, they have a slightly better 1-lap pace than Kick Sauber and Haas, but you go down to their race sims, they are 6/10 behind Kick Sauber, which, you know, you'd be forgiven for thinking that was the bus on the track on day 3, Kick Sauber, but Aston Martin clearly went and won up that. So I'm pretty, underwhelmed by what we've seen so far from the team in Silverstone. But again, maybe Newey enters the fold, rights the ship a little bit. I just think their attention's already on 2026. So I can't fault them for wanting to redirect their attention to other parts of the car, the work, the factory, etc. That may just put 2025 on the back burner for now. Into the bulk of the midfield, and if we start with a team that had a really strong finish to 2024, Pierre Gasly leads that Alpine outfit into this season. I think his reliability, his general pace and racecraft, definitely something to be considered. I think we're looking at drivers in the first few races that are either proven commodities or going to be starting away from, not the danger, but starting at the back or further toward the back, that they're not really putting themselves in positions of risk. I think Gasly's experience speaks for itself. He had 3 fantasy outings in the last 4 of 14 or more fantasy points. He had 4 races in the last 5 where he had points finishes. So I'm just very much encouraged by that kind of trajectory that Pierre Gasly's on, and definitely taking up that leadership mantle with Jack Doohan in the fold. A driver that I myself probably won't be going near, but again, probably in that Bortoleto, Isaac Hadjar price bracket where, he could just become a popular budget enabler. Now on to Haas, the big movers, I think, in terms of laps counted across all 3 days. Only 1 lap less than Mercedes, who took the top spot for laps. Same program they ran 12 months ago. Not really anyone was expecting a lot from Haas in 2024 in testing. They just banged out the laps, and they did so again this time around. I think Aya Komatsu, he's just sticking to the programs he wants to see. They want to get that long run pace that served them so well last year, kind of back to the front. So look, even if they may not necessarily on paper look like the fastest car going around, and I'll bring up the simulations I had just before as a kind of a good yardstick for that. These guys are considered to be, at the point in time, the worst qualifying team on the grid. But that simulation bodes well, to put them above Alpine, above Kick Sauber, above Aston Martin. I think Esteban Ocon and Ollie Behrman could be beacons of overtake and positions gained points. Again, same again in practice on day 2. These guys were firmly rooted at the bottom, and same again in day 1. Day 3, slightly further up the order, but I think maybe they were just focusing on shorter distances than perhaps what was the case in the first 2 days of testing. So I think Haas, they're just doing their own thing. Let them cook, and we'll see what happens come Australia. RB for me was the team that really didn't grab any headlines at all in Bahrain testing. I think Tsunoda's in that bucket of $7 to $10 million drivers, or so I would expect when the game goes live and prices are available, that he just won't be on the radar when you've got the Williams, you've got the maybe the Haas guys, Pierre Gasly, probably drawing our attention more towards. So for me, Tsunoda feels a little out of place, but his teammate Isaac Hadjar, who, there's been concerns around his temperament and such on track, could just be a cheap budget enabler similar to Doohan and Bortoleto that I've alluded to already. But I think the team that so many of us were talking about after the 3 days of testing in Bahrain, and particularly after day 2, was Williams. I was so pleased to see Carlos Sainz from the beginning set the tone for the team. Obviously, a great pedigree from Ferrari last year, set the fastest lap 2 years in a row, Ferrari last year, Williams this year over all 3 days, and then Albon backed that up with a P3 on day 3. So I think the single lap pace for this team is very, very encouraging. If we just swing it back to day 2 when Carlos had a very long stint in the car, he was in the top 2 in all 3 sectors in Bahrain. So, we already know he's a very good qualifier. He's bringing that to the table in Williams, an improved car on last year. He could be one to look out for. And then Albon, again, did a pretty similar effort on day 3 in that longer stint he had as well. So, look, I do think Williams deserving of a lot of hype, but I'm not going to buy into all of it just yet. I think, I've made the point before, and a number of fantasy content creators have discussed it, that, particularly Sainz could just be a driver that qualifies P8, finishes P8, only gets like 3 or 4 or 5 points a race, maybe even drops back a position or 2. So just be wary of that. He could also be overpriced. He could well come in at like 13 million because of how practice, I think, has overhyped the performance of that Williams. So if he does look like he's on the precipice of going into the B tier after the first couple of races, it may not be worth going for him, and instead maybe going for Albon, who could be a much more affordable price point. But we're going to have to wait and see what that looks like when the game goes live. And then very quickly on stake, I think they're going to be the slowest car. Not much of a surprise to anyone. But Bortoleto, winner in F2, winner in F3 back-to-back. George Russell, Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, the only drivers to have done that in consecutive rookie seasons in both formulas. So he could be a hidden gem. He could very much be the cheapest asset in the game, in the slowest car, and then just pick up a few points for overtakes, positions gained, what have you, when drivers ahead of him retire, crash out, have technical issues. So definitely a driver to keep your eye on, I think, heading into the deadline and when the game goes live. Now, what does this mean for our F1 fantasy teams? And I think the biggest question I've had, the most frequent question I've had, is when will F1 Fantasy launch? To my knowledge, there's not a confirmed date at the time of recording for when that will occur. But my suspicion is it's probably going to be on Monday or Tuesday, March 3rd/March 4th. The reason I say that is because the last 2 years, the game has gone live on a weekday. I suspect that's going to be the case again. And I say that because if it was to go live on a weekend, I just think there are many more people that are out and about, preoccupied. They're not checking their phone as much. I think there's more opportunity to drive initial engagement and uptick on a weekday. So my guess is Monday, Tuesday. That still gives us just under 2 weeks to tinker with our teams before the first deadline in Australia. And I think if, again, the developers factor in preseason testing for the prices, I think they'll hit the nail on the head there. So confident early next week will be when the game launches, but stay tuned to their Twitter and Instagram pages for Formula One to obviously know that exact date. They'll probably also tease a few prices for drivers and constructors in the lead up to that, as they have done the last couple of years. So just stay posted. And, if you follow me on Twitter and on YouTube, you'll know I'm going to be posting about that very regularly when everything kicks off. I talked about McLaren and Mercedes in terms of some of the assets I really like. I think if not Lando Norris, perhaps Oscar Piastri becomes a very viable 2x option. And again, talked about Mercedes as a B tier asset for the most part for all 3 assets. Fully expect that to continue this year, unless of course the pricing structure is overhauled. And I think Mercedes could be a very viable constructor to own out of the gate. So again, we'll have to wait and see what that looks like in practice in Australia. But they're 2 of the teams, and even Ferrari you could throw into there as well, where I'll probably want a little bit of coverage from at least a couple of those teams. Now, I mentioned just Piastri before. I think he appeals as a very likely 2x option. He finished every lap in every Grand Prix last year. The McLaren looks extremely competitive. Sure, he won't be on the same level as Lando Norris, but for a couple of million less, can he cover his production on a points per million basis? I'd say it's going to be pretty close. So I think Oscar could be a very good set and forget budget building 2x option. I'm not going to stray away from, the likes of Ferrari and McLaren, Ferrari and Mercedes, but Piastri for me, best car. I think this could be his breakout fantasy season. Let's see what that looks like for him. I've already, if I can get my words out, I've already talked about Carlos Sainz and his starting price in F1 fantasy in one of my predictions videos. If you've not seen it already, I think he'll come in around 11 to 13 million. I kind of stand by that still. Maybe on the upper end after what we've seen recently from Williams. But I do think, there's a world in which he kind of sits around P8, kind of gets 10 points, the odd price gain here or there, but Williams would have to be in the top 5, top 6, or at least Carlos would have to be outperforming the car to that point where he becomes a set and forget option in the C tier. So I'm really fascinated to see what his starting price will be, and he could be really overpriced, he could be underpriced. We'll just have to see what that looks like. And I've talked about targets in the midfield and the back markers. I think you've got Bortoletto, Doohan, Hadjar as your enablers, and then I think Albon, Gasly, as I've talked about, Ollie Behrman, or one of the Haas drivers at the very least, could be propping up our teams if we've already built out that 2 premium constructor and 2x driver slot. But again, once we've had prices announced, the game's going live, then I'll very much be able to get more granular with what team structures could look like in terms of the build out and the price or / budget gaining options early in the season. But I'm going to leave it there for now, guys. I hope it's been helpful, but I will be back with plenty more content once F1 Fantasy goes live, hopefully early next week. So as I said, stay tuned to all the channels. But if you're new around here or you're an experienced F1 Fantasy player, please do drop a like on the video. It does mean a lot to help the channel and to build that exposure in the early parts of the season. So in the meantime, guys, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all very soon.